food security by adding value to rice while at the same time create jobs for the locals. Hezron Kimari with the details from Taveta.
Well, it is a relief to rice farmers here in Taveta County after the county government started construction 45 million rice processing plant here in Taveta sub-county, where most of the rice farming activities have been taking place. And now we'll be getting an opportunity to hear sentiments by the rice farmers here in Taveta sub-county and also sentiments by other leaders, including the county governor.
Jambo la kufurahisha katika hii county yetu, hasa hii sub-county ya Taveta ambapo watu wanalima mpunga zaidi Mbogoni Road, ni kwamba watu wanatumia maji ya umwagiliaji na haya maji yanapatikana mfululizo mwaka mzima. Kwa hivyo mpunga huu utalimwa wakati wote wa mwaka. Hatutasema kuna msimu. Kutakuwa kunalimwa mpunga kuanzia Januari mpaka Disemba. Sasa sisi ndio tutaketi na wakulima tuweze kuwahamasisha kama idara kuwa walime kwa mifumo, ili watu wakilima mwezi huu kama ni Kitobo, mwezi ujao hiyo watu wa Kimorigo, mwezi ule mwingine watu wa Mata Road, mwezi ule mwingine tupate ile Sagala, mwezi ule mwingine tupate ya Bura. Utakuta kutakuwa na mzunguko. Wakati wa kuvuna, kila wakati tutakuwa tunavuna na kila wakati tutakuwa tunaotesha. Kwa hivyo kutakuwa na mzunguko mzima.
Probably because hatujafanya soil testing, but najua tulifanya soil testing, ni matokeo hatujajulishwa vizuri ili tuweze kujua ni mbolea gani tunastahili kutumia. Sababu mostly mpunga unapata unahitaji either sulfate ammonia ama urea, na ukienda kule kwa store wewe ni mkulima umezoea urea, unapata hakuna urea, unalazimishwa kununua ile sulfate ammonia ama CAN. Na labda wewe umezoea SA, inabidi utumie urea. So hiyo pia wakiweza kufanya data wajue ni mbolea gani wakulima wana prefer, but also waweze to advise according to our soil. Watufanyie soil testing vizuri na wakulima wote washauriwe kulingana na mashamba yao.
Tumeunda umoja wa wakulima wa mpunga, yani Rice Growers Cooperative Society ambayo inaitwa USWI. Cooperative hiyo tumeamua kuiunda ili tuwe na ile Waingereza wanaita bargaining power. Yani tukikuwa pamoja tunaweza kuamua kwamba tunauza kwa bei gani. Na pia vile vile tuweze kufikia soko. Napokuwa na soko iko wapi, na pia tujue bei kwa wakati ule ambao mmea wetu uko tayari, bei ya sokoni ni kiasi gani. Basi itakuwa rahisi sisi kupanga hata sisi pia bei. Lakini kwa sababu hilo mpaka sasa hajatengemaa sawa sawa, basi tunanunuliwa na wale wajanja ambao ni brokers.
Wamekuwa na matatizo mengi. Maana yake wanaosafirisha wengine mpaka wapeleke Mwea, wengine wanapeleka kwa nchi yetu jirani, walikuwa na matatizo mengi. So kwa kupitia kwa huu mtambo najua tutaboresha ukulima wa mchele vile mnaoita hapa mpunga, na pia vijana watasaidika kwa makazi, wamama watakuwa wanajiwezesha wenyewe wakilima mchele, wazee, ambapo ndio mambo sisi tunataka kama county, kama jimbo la county. Unajua kuna dhambi zilifanyika hapo nyuma, serikali kuu haikutuangalia hata na kiwanda hata kimoja. So changamoto ya makazi kwa vijana imekuwa kubwa sana. Sasa tukifanya mambo kama haya, angalau yanapunguza hiyo tatizo la makazi.
Well, as you have heard from the rice farmers and also leaders, they are hoping this project will be coming along to improve food security in this county and also improve market for the rice farmers who previously have been forced to ferry their produce to Mwea. But currently they are hoping after this project will be completed, the farmers here in Taveta County will be seeing the value for their produce. Reporting for KTN News from Taveta, I'm Hezron Kimari.
Thank you, Hezron, for that report. And now let's go straight to talking about food security a little bit. Now, food security, when we talk about climate change, is a problem that we experience as Africa. We know we just came from the worst drought in over 4 decades. Then that was followed by drought. Now, here's a question where right now in Nairobi is super hot. So now food security is a conversation that is ongoing even as we look for solutions towards climate change and the effects, the ravages that we continue to experience. And do you think that as a global population, we have found a balance, we've found a solution to food insecurity?
Thank you. it's still a challenge, a big gap. One of the reasons why, for instance, a country like Kenya is still food insecure is because our farming is threatened by climate change. Our agricultural setup is heavily dependent on rain. So we've seen changing weather patterns, so rain not coming when the planting season is around, and farmers are not able to really know when to plant and when not to plant. As you saying that it's hot in Nairobi, I was talking to my aunt early in the day. She's saying it's super raining in Narok, where she had gone to harvest. So you see those disparities are not making it suitable for us to then do farming in a more sustainable way. It's as opposed to developed countries that have the structures like doing large-scale irrigation and farming. There they are able to then harvest. They have storage facilities that can store the harvest and sustain their economies. So we need to then have the discussions as African countries. Kenya, for instance, how do we then take advantage? When, for instance, we've seen in the past when there's plenty harvest, like there's a situation where we had a lot of, the milk producing community had plenty of milk, and because they didn't have storage facilities, they were selling the milk at throwaway prices, and in some scenarios they were, the milk was going stale and they just had to do away with it. But then how do we introduce, systems where they can have coolers where they can store the milk? How do they add value to the milk and produce other products that are more have a longer shelf life, and then they can be able to earn from that. So we need to explore, improve our farming methods. So adopt, for instance, irrigation methods. So we have solar-powered irrigation that is sustainable. We also need to explore the use of technologies for farming. This thing of relying on human labor, somebody with a djembe going to dig, how far can they dig? But if you're relying on technology, we're not saying that technology will replace humans, but then at the end of the day, we need to strike a balance, just to ensure that you don't send other people home packing because of introduction of technology. We need to introduce things like solar dryers for the fishing communities. How do they use sustainable energy sources to store their fish? How do we introduce coolers, refrigerators that are powered by solar, so that you cut all those costs and heavy reliance on fossil fuels? How do we ensure that our communities have sufficient storage of water? As you clearly said, Kenya is a case example where when it's flooding, all the water goes on runoff, and 2 months down the line, we are complaining about drought. Yet we could have taken measures to come up with dams, water pans that can help us to store that water for use for farming, for instance. How do we support our pastoral communities? When there was a heavy drought, I think last year we saw the Maasai community, which are famous in keeping cows, coming all the way even to the city, just in search of pasture. So how do we ensure that we support these communities to harvest pasture when it's the season is good, store them so that their livestock don't have to we incurred a lot of losses when the drought hit. For instance, the northern parts of the country where they heavily depend on the keeping livestock. So how do we come in to this calls upon the government to put in place measures in a proactive manner, so allocation of those resources and actually using those resources, not the dramas you were seeing the other day. I don't want to mention them. So that we ensure that we support our communities genuinely, because people die, people are losing their sources of livelihood, and at the end of the day, nobody comes to compensate for that.
And even when you're talking about introducing agriculture to these communities, I remember the second story that we ran from Samburu,
yes,
where guys have introduced
yes,
carbon markets and projects, and they're now
yes,
harvesting pasture for their own animals.
Yes,
I mean,
yes, yes,
it's a bad time that we take such advantage of such initiatives and get into that. But even as we talk about irrigation, introducing irrigation, running away from rain-fed agriculture, there is the access to renewable energy, because there's a conversation going around, especially in these spaces, called greenwashing.
Yes.
Fine, you are growing at huge tracts of land, but you're using fossil fuels to dig and do all that. So therefore, still comes back to access to renewable energy, say if it's solar systems. We know that the cobalt that is being mined in Congo goes to develop these batteries. So therefore, what conversation must we have such that even if we're buying solar and storage that we need to run our farms, to run our factories, that we get them at a subsidized rate, that even the investments to produce these resources are actually in Africa? Are we at a level where we're having that discussions with the developed world?
Yes, okay. Even not looking at the developed world, let's look at our internal capacity. Kenya has brilliant minds. Africa in general has brilliant minds. But what do? We educate them and then export this manpower to go and support developed countries in growing their economies. We've not seen enough sufficient investments in research in Kenya. Of course, we have institutions of higher learning. We have some institutions by a government and private entities who are doing research work. But then there is a lot of gap. Yes, they do research, they publish data. It's good, but it's stored in shelves. When it comes to implementation, nobody takes up the findings of those research to then translate them into policies, translate them into initiatives that can then come to benefit these communities. We are, one of the things you've been complaining about is substandard products coming and technologies coming from outside the country and being dumped here in Africa at very exorbitant prices. And something, you buy a solar product, 3-6 months down the line, it's malfunctioned. This is something, a product that was, was to be thrown away in another country where it was produced. But because somebody realized that Africans can be taken for a ride, and they decided to export them here. And because we are vulnerable, and we don't have that capacity to produce those technologies, then we took them up, and then our communities end up suffering. Because one of the misconceptions is actually for those substandard products, many people fear purchasing these renewable energy products because many of them malfunction sooner than later after they have started to use them. So how do we make use of the capacity that we have, grow the skills locally, use the available technologies? If we have to import products, let's not import finished products. Let's import those equipments and parts that we feel are able to, we cannot produce here locally. Import them, make technologies that are within and that can be able to support us, because we can export those technologies to other countries. We have the capacity. I think it's all calls for the goodwill of the government. How do we provide a conducive environment for uptake of some of these solutions? How do we create incentives for some of these raw materials that we are required to import to produce the technologies? How do we ensure that our curriculum is well tuned in a manner that can be able to provide the knowledge and the skills and the capacity for, because we have the TVETs, which are very good platforms that can build the skills of these young people. How do we train them, other than just educating people and giving them the knowledge? How do you also empower them to be entrepreneurs, not people who are going to school and then just depend on the white collar jobs? Somebody completes school and then they have to start applying for jobs. 3 years down the line, they just get regret emails and then they lose hope. And yet they have a potential to come up with technologies, help us in managing some of the existing technology. So we need to build our own capacity, and once we get to the level of, depending on the developed countries, there are other things we can, reach out to them when it comes to financial support. But I think we have the capacity to be able to produce those technologies here in the country.
And now if we have the discussion, just paint a picture of how important the entire conversation on energy transition is key in changing the tide, on reducing the degree, the global temperature that we can achieve. Just how important is energy transition in this conversation?
Thank you. So the last year's COP, we had the first global stocktake that was looking at how the global community is faring in regards to the Paris Agreement that set out the target of 1.5. And the findings are really showing that we are off track in achieving that. So, for instance, we need to cut down our emissions by 43% in order for us to achieve the target. And that then puts energy transition at the center of all this, because the emissions are from fossil fuels. So then the just transition comes into play as the best alternative for us to achieve this target. So we need to have more discussions. We need, I don't know which push we will use for developed countries to really phase out the fossil fuels that the economies are heavily dependent on, so that they can, because Africa, we don't, our emissions is barely 4% of the total global emissions. So for us, we are doing pretty much well when it comes to emissions. So the discussion has to be within the developed countries, which they definitely do not want to have. And yet they're the ones who are telling us we are off track. Because when it comes to the leadership of UNFCCC and all those things, the COPs and everything, they're the ones who constitute the final say. And yet they're the ones who do not want to transition. So how do we then support? I don't know if they will need our support to transition. We need to show them how we are doing it in our countries, because they always feel and think that the best things comes from the north, but they also can come and benchmark and learn how are we doing it, how are we able to produce energy from these renewable resources, and for them to adopt and accept those discussions. So the discussion is more to focus on the global north, who are heavily dependent on that. When discussing about just transition, of course, there are different elements we need to look at. For instance, ensuring that those who, the issues of human rights, labor, so that those who depend on those, the people who work there, provide labor, they do not lose their jobs because of the transition. But as we said, we are not stopping the use of fossil fuels and then go home and sit down. We are stopping the use of fossil fuels, but adopting renewable energy. So how do we create job opportunities for these people who are depending on the fossil fuels industries to sustain them? How do we ensure that we observe human rights and ensure at the end of the day there's fairness, justice, and equity?
Brian Omenyi, Coordinator, Sustainable Energy Forum Access Kenya, says that we all must pull our weight to make sure that we change the tide, that energy transition is a very important subject that we all must be part of. My name is Dennis Aseto. Many thanks for watching Planet Action. Eric Latif will be coming next with the Newsline on KTN.